Hi, we continue in Genesis 4 today with this section of our story where Cain and Yahweh have the conversation after Cain's murder of Abel. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, we're taking this up in the B1, the blue section of the chiasm. So as we go through the other side of the parallels here, first we had the dialogue, although it was really only one-sided, of God questioning Cain and warning him about sin crouching at the door. Then we saw the murder, and now we see God and Cain on the other side of the chiasm. Also important to be looking at here as we continue through this are the parallels between what happens in this scene and what we saw in the curse in Genesis 3. So let's look at some examples of that here. So we saw in the beginning in Genesis 3, there was the question of where. Where are you? He said to the Adam, and where is your brother Abel to Cain? Then we see what something can be easily hidden in the translation, the unusual use of the formal Hebrew pronoun anoki in both these places here, and only there and one other place coming up. So even though the English I is common, the formal Hebrew form is not. And so we see that here, both at the end of a sentence, that I hid myself, Adam says, and am I my brother's keeper? My brother's keeper am I, literally, as Cain says. Then in both there's the accusation, have you eaten from the tree, and what have you done? And then a curse in relation to the Adamah, to the ground. So cursed is the ground because of you, to the Adam, and then cursed, or you are cursed from the ground, to Cain. Then the outcome of that in relation to food, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and to Cain the ground will no longer yield its strength. And there's both a question of banishment, using the same verb there for drive out. He drove out the man, and Cain saying, today you've driven me from the soil, and they both end with east of Eden. So parallels in both those cases, both those stories that we'll see here between the sending out from the garden and the sending out of Cain from God's presence. So let's look at some details of the Hebrew here, and we'll see some other elements of the parallels as we look up close. And as you can see in this section, I've highlighted on the left side, the word brother, used so many times, 6 times in these few verses, so including the verse we looked at last time. And as we saw last time, Abel is a brother to Cain, but Cain is never said to be a brother to Abel. So we see brother Abel, brother Abel, brother Abel, brother's blood, but Cain is never described as a brother here. So Yahweh said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. This is the first case of not knowing, of lo yada here. So there was the question of the knowledge of good and evil. Then you can see from my note below in chapter 3, verse 5 and 7. And then the Adam knew his woman, by that time Eve in 4:1, and here we have the not knowing. So in great contrast with the knowing of the knowledge of good and evil, Cain says he does not know. And he raises the classic question, am I my brother's keeper? And notice that Cain doesn't ever call him Abel either. He just refers to my brother in the abstract there. Many scholars and interpreters have seen this as somehow Cain is indifferent to his brother, but it's a real question, isn't it? At this point in the narrative, what does Cain know about his responsibilities? There's no law, there's no Torah, there's no rules that he knows about other than the one that his parents were told to not eat from that tree, and he doesn't even have access to that tree. So there are no rules. It's a purely anarchistic situation as far as he knows. So although we can read that as sarcastic or denying, it also is a real question of what is the relationship between one human being and another, especially the blood relationship of brothers, and blood is the key here. The word for keeper here, shamir here, is the word for like shepherd. So Wenham notes this as a potential irony. Am I the shepherd's shepherd, since Abel was a keeper of sheep? And so we see in the response here, as Westerman has noted here, the relatively passive description of the murder in contrast with the dramatic high point of the interrogation here. So the murder was done in just part of a verse, as you can see in verse 8 above, and yet this extensive interrogation between Yahweh and Cain. So Yahweh said, what have you done? And of course the issue isn't that he doesn't know, it's asking Cain to take account of it. Literally the word from the Hebrew, as you can see down below, is what have you made? a direct challenge to other human making, the remaking of the earth in our image, as opposed to our being made by God in God's image. So again, here to listen, or the voice of, here echoing what we saw last time with the voices. So one of those many parallels. And here in a gripping image that may run counter to our understanding of things, but is important to listen to. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and that's connected in the next verse to the image we see here. The ground has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand, as if it's somehow a gift, or is it a curse to the ground? So the blood is crying out, and the ground has a mouth that is open to receive this blood. In other words, throughout this, as we saw in Genesis 1, the blood, Dam, and the Adamah are creatures. They're responsive here. They're part of God's creation. So whether we understand that literally as blood crying out, or just the life of Abel is crying out here, either way, the fact that Abel is dead does not mean that God cannot hear the cry of the poor or the cry of the victims here. The word for Dam here, for blood here, Dam, is the first time it's being used. We noted earlier how it's a wordplay with Adam, the earthling, and Adamah, the topsoil. And so blood in that sense is living topsoil flowing through people. There's also a question of singular and plural. As my note down below from Westerman says, Dam is constantly in the plural as long as it refers to the blood of another shed violently, which is upon the murderer's head. So Imaton is the Septuagint version of it here, and curiously, it's often misleadingly understood, as something else in John's Gospel. But here, the John's Gospel parallel notes what's at issue here is that blood as a plural refers to blood shed. So in John's Gospel, not born of blood is not about genetics or lineage, as it is not claiming one's identity from bloodshed. And when we get to doing a John's Gospel series, we'll look at that in some detail. But certainly John's Gospel is echoing much of Genesis, and certainly has this in mind here. People's identity is not claimed by shedding the blood of another. And here, Cain's identity doesn't come from that, but the blood crying out to God expresses the cry of the victims of violence here. So crying out to me here. And as Westerman again notes, the most important word in the sentence, and is to follow in his quote there is worth listening to. The murderer has no escape when faced with this question, because there is someone who hears the victim's blood crying out. These words, valid for the whole history of humankind, protect the person as a creature of God from other people. And we'll see many examples in our Revelation series. We'll see how those under the altar who were killed for their witness are also crying out to God for justice. So in response to the blood's crying out, God responds here with the curse, just like we saw here in chapter 3, responding to the curse of the ground. And notice that it's not that Cain is cursed directly, cursed from the ground. And that's worth looking at in some detail. The word for curse here, auror, is the traditional word we've seen from curse, but it's connected with from here, min, so that's what leads some to translate as banished. Putting those two together, cursed away from the ground as banished, expressing some sense that this is expressing exile. We can read this as Cain being something like Judah and Abel being something like Israel, or at least some violence within the people of God, so that being cursed away from the ground expresses that sense of exile to Babylon, away from the holy ground of Jerusalem as it had been understood. So this ground has opened its mouth, and plainly it's a metaphor here. The only other mouth in the primeval history, as you can see in my note, is the dove at 8:11 that has the olive branch in its mouth. But it's going to move here from mouth to face as an element. So just as the earth has opened its mouth, the earth's face will be hidden from Cain, as we'll see in just a moment. So here we move further into the outcome here of the curse. So when you till the ground, Cain being the farmer that he was in the face of Abel's being the shepherd. So as his farmer, it will no longer yield to you its strength. Lo, thosef keth. And the word for keth here, strength, is only a couple further times in Genesis, referring to as you can see here, just for example, in 49:3, referring to Reuben's power. So power to produce things, and the earth's power will no longer be available to Cain, paralleling the thorns and thistles that his father would be said to experience in his struggle with the earth over food. Then we get to a very difficult to translate element of this, a fugitive and wander. And you can see from here a range of ways that this is translated. And one of the big questions is the Hebrew navanad, a hendiadys, which is to say two things put together by an and that express one thing, as we see in the examples here: a roving nomad, a homeless wanderer, a constant wanderer, a wandering vagrant? Or is it two different things together, as we see in a fugitive and a vagabond, a fugitive and a wanderer, or a waver and a wanderer? There's probably not a way to answer that. It can carry all of those things. But the words do relate to the question of being unsteady, as you can see there from the notes, that moving unsteadily on the earth. As my note from below from Westerman says, the one cursed becomes holy, that is taboo. So the curse sets him aside, and that's the very meaning of holy, is to be set aside. We'll see how that plays out when we look at the follow-up with what Ched Myers has interestingly called the tattoo of taboo, that the mark that God gives Cain for protection. So either way, however we interpret this, Cain is no longer at home on the earth, a waver and a wanderer, a constant wanderer, making his way around. We'll see next time, we'll see this time before we go, so I'll save my comment there. So Cain's response is, my punishment is greater than I can bear, and there's some translation issues here too. The word for punishment, awan, is only used a couple of more times here, but 233 times in the Masoretic text. It can refer to either the punishment or the iniquity, so in other words, it could be that his guilt is too great or the punishment is too great. And so we see a number of ranges of translations there. You see from the Targum down below, my debts are too numerous to bear, so it could be read either way. The word for bear here, though, nis, echoes the difficult to translate verse we saw in 4:7 last time. So highlighting there, you could bear it aloft is one way to put it, in the face of what the response to sin would be. So it's clearly echoing that there, whether sin was something that could be borne, or here whether the punishment or his guilt is something that could be borne or carried around. So he's complaining that either way, either he can't be forgiven or that the punishment is too much. And Cain continues here, and we'll finish with his end of his speech, and then we'll turn to Yahweh's next time. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and that driving, as we see here, echoes the driving out the Adam and the woman, of course, from the garden. Driven me away from the soil, as if there's another place to go, and Cain will literally invent another place to go, and we'll see that next time with the building of the city. Soil here is literally the face of the ground, pene adamah, literally from the face of the soil, which is important because the next phrase says, "I shall be hidden from your face." So he's both driven away from the face of the soil and from the face of Yahweh at the same time. And again, highlighting here that God is present in and with the earth, in great contrast to later Christian theology grounded in Platonism that separated humans from our earthiness and from the rest of creation. It's something we're still getting over in an era of climate change and mass species extinction. Shall be hidden from your face and from the soil, and he repeats exactly what God said, fugitive and wanderer. And anyone who meets me may kill me. Which is a strange thing because there are no other people here. So plainly that's not about literally Cain, because anybody who would come, where would they come from? There's only his parents, and Abel's dead. And we'll see next time how the text finagles its way around the question of where Cain's wife come from and where anybody else came from. But he has a generalized fear of someone who's been cursed, that no one would receive him and that anybody would kill him. We won't see the fate of Cain facing into that kind of threat, but the fact that he fears that highlights the fear of anybody who's been forced to leave a familiar home and go wander out into a great unknown. So that's where we're going to stop today, with Cain afraid that the consequence of his action is something more than we can bear. And perhaps surprisingly, Yahweh will relent and make the punishment not as bad as it might have been. So we'll pick it up there next time. See you then. Bye-bye.